Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth part in our six-part training on creating our Shiny applications and dashboards. I would like to thank the Bureau of Justice Statistics for their support, which makes this training possible. I want to welcome back our presenter, Dr. Robert Ashmead. You all recall Dr. Ashmead is a senior statistician at NORC at the University of Chicago. With that being said, I will turn things over to Dr. Ashmead.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm glad to see you all here again for another session on our Shiny dashboards. Today, the plan is to talk about a couple different smaller chunks of topics. Some practical things like how we host and share our dashboards, some tips on accessibility, some changes we can make in our dashboards to make them more accessible, and then also kind of a more technical piece, which will be helpful for us going into our next session, is about dynamic UI elements. So that's the plan for today. Planning for about an hour. Last time we talked about interactive tables and interactive plots and maps. Um, and we had a take home. I saw at the very end of our last session that there's maybe a question in the comments that I didn't quite finish responding to before the class was over. So I just thought I'd take a minute here at the start and see if there was any questions that came up stemming from the content of the last class before we kind of jump into things. Okay. Well, this kind of review of this take-home activity, I think will be a good reminder of what we did last time too. So it was a little bit of a challenge to you all. I don't know if anyone took me up on it, but if you recall from last time, we made this interactive leaflet map, and it had the calculations for the totals of different arrest categories for our Florida data example. But one thing that our map didn't take into account at all is that, counties have different population sizes. So it makes sense that some will have more or less arrests than others. So a good thing to do from kind of an analytical point of view is to probably standardize by the county population. So the take-home activity for kind of improving our dashboard here was to find a source for county populations for Florida and use it as a denominator in the calculations, and add it as an option that the user can select to turn on and off. So this is how I went about doing that. Um, First thing I found, there's lots of places where we can get county populations. I found a source of county populations on the Census Bureau website for their county population by characteristics. Um, and so I found the actual URL for a CSV file here for those populations. And I added some code into global to load those county populations in, and then selected the county name and the population estimate. And then I joined that to our geographic information. So I took our geographic object and I did a join by the county name in order to add that population estimate onto that file. All this is what gets I added into global. The next thing I did was add a checkbox option to our UI. That this is going to be our UI option to turn on and off um, the standardization, the denominator. And so you can see, I just by default turned it on with the value equals true and gave it a input ID. And then the most of what I needed to do was in the server to update the server so we have this option to compute the rates. I chose per 10,000 persons. So how I did that was I just added this second piece here to our map data. So previously we had, we'd filter by our date ranges, we'd group by county, we'd added up these totals of arrests and by different degrees. Um, what I did next was I then added additional variables where for each of these variables that we created earlier, um, I did use this mutate at function. This is a dplyr function that means apply the same mutate to several other variables. So what it is it applies a mutate to these ones that I selected. So it's saying um, I choose the variables, all of them, all of these variables, total, first degree, second degree, third degree, capital, and life, which are the ones we defined here. And then for each of those, it's going to make a new variable. This is kind of like the name it gives a tag it puts at the end of it. And then what this is saying is take the variable. This is kind of the syntax for taking the variable and dividing by the population estimate standardized by that 10K. Um, and then returning that. And then what I had to do was, depending on the option, kind of tell it which variables to use in the actual map. So I did this by a little bit of logic within our render leaflet. So I made these options basically if else options here. So if the button is clicked, um, my variable text basically use the rate per 10K or don't. And I updated the legend, a similar logic for the legend so that it would have the right text on it. And then I just used that kind of dynamic variable when we are creating both our fill and our legend. So if we put all that together, um, if you downloaded the materials for today, this is the take home one. You can see what that looks like. Let's do some downloading. Okay, so now you can see our UI option here, standardize, don't standardize. Um, and if we turn it off, you see I have the total prosecutions here. I turn it on, total prosecutions per 10K, and we see some, potentially different patterns if we're just looking at the total versus that standardized. Let's see. If we call out specific counties may look, different. This one, Duval had a high number kind of total count, whereas if you standardize, it kind of looks within the typical range there. And then,
Robert, would you mind to send the link to the material one more time? I think
Mhm.
uh, some of the participants have issue accessing it.
I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone. So what we're going through, if you download it as a zip and unzip it, we're going through like the session 4 material today. Awesome. Okay. So that was how I constructed this kind of optional standardization here to have kind of better better analytical options for our map. Any questions to that approach, or anybody else give that a try and have a different way they accomplished it that they want to highlight? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move on to our content for today. So we're going to start with talking about hosting, which, everything we've done up to this point, we've done on our own computers, and but that doesn't really allow other people to see what you're doing and using your dashboards, except I guess if you're sharing them on Zoom calls like we are now. Um, then we're going to talk about those accessibility resources and tips and the dynamic UI elements. So, how can other people see my apps, aka hosting? So, in order for other people to see your app, they need to have access to the computer that is actually running it. So generally speaking, your personal machines, my laptop, they're not set up to do this. Instead, what we usually use for this task is called a server. Um, this could be one that is on premises at your work or school. It could also be on the cloud. There are a lot of cloud resources these days where people do tasks like this. But you need some sort of machine that is set up so other people can have access. Um, or it can put out the information for the dashboard. So I'm going to go through a couple options that are out there today. There aren't necessarily like a ton of different ways to do this currently, but I will highlight the ones that at least I know about and can talk a little bit about my experience with them. The first option is called open source Shiny Server. So this is a Posit um, product. Posit, the same people that make our studio. This is basically their free option. Um, it You can use this locally on your premises for if you have a server or something like an Amazon AWS server or any kind of cloud-based computing. It is free, but Posit has multiple products, and this is kind of the lower tier one that is free and open source, which means that it doesn't have complete functionality that you might want. It doesn't have support because you're not paying for it. It has a little bit of scaling issues depending on how many people are accessing your dashboard at once. This is something that you would probably need to work with your IT department in any of these cases to help set these up. Um, but the first option is that open source Shiny server. The second option is called Posit Connect. This is kind of the second level from the Posit software group. This is a paid service for hosting apps on your server called Posit Connect. It has a lot of features additional features beyond just hosting dashboards as well. You can build APIs into it. It has users and password authentication and protection built in. You can do some cool things with a feature called pins, which allows you to put data on the server as well. The positives of this is that of all the products, this is going to be the easiest to use. The push button once you have it up and running, lots easy for lots of people to use simultaneously. It has a lot of features that are really nice. It integrates well with RStudio because that's their own product. Um, Usually there's some sort of service contract. If you run into problems or have questions, you can reach out to them. only negative really is that depending on your organization and needs and how you use it, it could be expensive. It does require licenses per user, including both people that are publishing dashboards as well as folks that would be viewing them if they're restricted at all. And those can just add up quite a bit if depending on the number of users that you need to buy licenses for. So that's the second option. But I have used this a bunch in my work. It works great. It just if it can add up in terms of the cost if you run into a lot of users and licenses. Let me see if there's anything on the website. So yeah, lots of people are using this today. Some alternative options. So there's a product that's actually also affiliated with Posit called shinyapps.io, and it allows you to host an app in the cloud. And this is kind of an on-demand kind of a product in that the cost depends on how many apps you have and how many hours they are used for. And this is actually free for up to 25 hours per month. So this is nice. The positives here, it's very easy to use. It's free or inexpensive for small amounts of use. Some drawbacks could be the data is actually lives in the cloud. So if you have a dashboard which maybe has some sensitive data which you don't want to have to share, you don't have to push in a different environment than your own. This is probably not the best resource. It also lacks some level of customization for like how you can make everything look in terms of not the actual dashboard, but kind of the pieces around the dashboard. So it's a little bit more difficult to make it look like your group or your university that has kind of like branding around it. So it is also affiliated with Posit. It's kind of their alternative way to deploy dashboards. So that means they've integrated how it works very well into the RStudio product that most people use. Um, and you can actually, if you have this link here from our notes, I've actually pushed a version of our dashboard that we've been kind of using for an example as it exists to this shinyapps.io. So we could take a little bit of a look for what that looks like. I think what's happening here, it does take a little bit to spin up because it's on demand. So it's not running all the time. So I believe it has to be created every time we go to it. So this is free we're using the up to 25 hours uh, free version of this. So as long as we don't spend more than 25 hours here collectively, this should continue to work. But this is just a version of our code that we've pushed here. So should be the exact same as earlier example. Just to kind of show you a little bit more what's happening there, how that works, and how it's relatively easy. So I made the version that I actually pushed to the shinyapps.io in this one of the examples. The one difference I wanted to highlight here, in all our previous examples, because we've been using this shared data and I didn't want to copy the data file into every single folder, those kind of use a directory behind our examples. Like we don't store the actual data in here. In practice, to deploy this, I moved the source of the data inside this folder. And the reason being is the RStudio detects what it needs to push to the shinyapps.io a little bit better after I've moved it inside. So, once you've set up your account with them, basically what you need to do, how I did this. So if we just went to our run example, um, instead of doing this launch browser option for running it, if I do the option without it, it brings it up into the kind of internal viewer for RStudio. And in the top right corner of that is actually this option here where it says republish. If I hadn't done this before, it would just say publish. But you can see here, if I click into this, it just has information about where to publish. So you can link this up. If I hadn't done this in the first place, um, you can add a new account, and you can see here shinyapps.io. And if you follow these instructions after you've made an account, you can link your RStudio with this, and use that to basically push button, tell it what you want to publish, tell it where, and when we do that, it does all the work for us to push it up into that shinyapps.io. So that's very easy to work, very quick. The Posit Connect works very similarly. You could see there is an option actually here for Posit Connect, the same way you can connect to it. That's one of the benefits of the Posit options, is that that's very interconnected with this RStudio kind of environment. So that's shinyapps.io. A fourth option for kind of on-demand dashboard in the cloud is, I haven't actually used this before, but I came across it recently. It's called Heroku. It's a service that allows you to host your app, and deals with some of the environmental, like setting up an environment that makes it easy to host it. And similarly to uh, shinyapps.io, the pricing scales with the runtime. So it's all the prices kind of per hour kind of a situation. Um, it's a little bit more complicated to use than shinyapps.io. It uses Docker, but it's not too difficult. Um, it does allow quite a bit of customization, and it can be economical for small amounts of use. The negatives, the downsides of that, obviously you're pushing your data to the cloud. So, just making sure the security is in line with what that needs to be for the whatever data source you're using. The last option that I'll highlight here is an open source method called Shiny Proxy for hosting our Shiny apps. This is kind of more in line with the open source Shiny server or Posit Connect. It's kind of in between those two. It is outside of the Posit ecosystem, but it's a way that you can either set up a server locally on your premises, or you could also do this in the cloud, but host multiple dashboards on that server. It works with this technology called Docker, where you build images of your dashboard, meaning kind of all the instructions to build it. And you need to be very familiar with Docker to be able to make this work. Um, the positives are it's free and open source to use this Shiny proxy. You may need a license for Docker depending on your situation, but for most small organizations, Docker is free. It scales well and allows a lot of customization. However, you do need a pretty high level of expertise to set it up. That's kind of the trade-off you get with open source versus paid products is the paid products, they make them a lot easier to set up and use, but that's why you have to, pay the money. But the open source, you can achieve it, but you need to figure out a lot of the setup for the IT yourself. So this is actually one in my old position at Ohio State. We set up, and we were kind of a small group, myself and one IT professional were able to set this up, and it is up and running, hosting their dashboards currently. So it can be done. It works fairly well. Um, any questions about those different options, or anything else to highlight there? Does anyone currently have a setup to host Shiny dashboards? I'm wondering. Well, if you have questions, feel free to reach out on those different options. Okay, well, okay. So if there's not any other questions about hosting, we can move on to our next topic for today, which is accessibility. Um, I do want to credit, I attended a talk. JSM is Joint Statistical Meetings, so I'm a statistician as a background, and I encountered this talk by Neil J. Hatfield, who talked specifically about accessibility in our Shiny. So it took a lot of the tips away from that. So all credit to Neil for that. Um, so there's a little bit of a push and pull for Shiny, is that it allows a fairly easy way to make these, great web applications without having to know kind of base HTML, CSS, these low level um, languages. Or we don't really have to know how websites work more generally. The downside is that, when we're using these tools, we don't always know the best practices for creating applications that meet web accessibility standards. So if you haven't come across it before, there's this whole uh, document and website here about accessibility standards, or WSAC, with lots of information about what the kind of the standards are for making websites accessible. One great tool that I've come across and was recommended to try to evaluate websites in general, but we can use it for our Shiny to see how accessible our website is, and tips for making it more accessible, is this something called this Wave browser extension. I think there's several ways, options for using it, but I think in most major browsers, there's some sort of extension. So I've installed this Wave evaluation tool into my browser here that's going to help us. I think some browsers also have some like default accessibility testing as well. Um, so I'll just show you what that looks like. So let's run one of our, um, maybe just the take home version. Apologies. Okay, so if we have this up and running, I'm actually going to click over to something a little bit more interesting. So if we go to extensions and we run this extension, we actually get a bunch of information. It tells us about um, our dashboard. So it is saying that we have a couple errors, some contrast errors. Some of this is just information as well. But it goes through that and kind of tells us some different things. So it's telling us uh, we have a missing or invalid language. We have some contrast errors in that the color differentiation between this gray and the white is not good enough to meet the contrast standards. It also giving us some alerts for some possible missing values or some just small labels, it seems to say. So if we switch, I believe to make this work, you have to kind of um, exit out. And if you were to wanted to look at a different page, you'd have to rerun it for each page. It kind of fixes things once you turn it on. But this is a great tool to kind of test your dashboard and see where you can possibly improve some things. Let me find my slides again. So there's a couple kind of easy things we can do that some of these popped up in terms of when we turned on that Wave browser extension. Um, the first thing is we had that error about the language being missing. So by default, for whatever reason, I guess I'm not an expert in websites, but HTML should have a language like English, Spanish, etc. That it is telling the browser it is using, and that is so that when screen readers can read the website, they know what language it's supposed to be. And by default, for whatever reason, Shiny doesn't give a default value, but we can add that into our app pretty easily. So you can see here, all you need to do to add English, specifically US English, I guess is the designation for HTML, is at the top of our UI where we just have, for example, we had our nav page. We had our title, our theme. If we just add language, lang equals en US, that's all we need to do to fix that language error here. Obviously, if you're writing your dashboard in a different language, you could use a different one there. The next thing is HTML tags. So we talked a little bit about this in terms of, I think, 2 classes ago, where we said you can use these tags for like different levels of headings or to mark paragraphs and lists. And so the tip for improving accessibility is so the screen readers are using those things to kind of both navigate around the page and to know where things are. So A, to use those when you're kind of putting text in, and B, especially with like header levels, not to skip. So, you have these different like header level 1, 2, 3, 4. So not skipping over levels when you're doing that. I guess it confuses the screen reader when you do that kind of thing. Including meaningful labels for inputs. So when we are putting kind of those the input widgets into our UI, we have that label marker for them. So that not only shows up on the screen as the label, but kind of is in the background of the HTML page as something that is telling the actual label of it. So making sure those are kind of meaningful if they were to be kind of read from a screen reader point of view. Color contrast. So we had that error from the Wave extension about one of our color contrasts and making sure that meets, there's different levels of contrast and some minimum standards there. The last thing is alt text, so alternative text. So when we have graphics, I think that are specifically, not decorative, the standards are supposed to be that, you have some sort of alternative text explaining what that dashboard is, or explaining what that graphic shows in alternative text. And so we're actually going to talk how we can add that to at least our ggplots. Okay, so, and apologies, trying to get back to my code here. So if we look at this accessibility example here, I'm actually just going to open up all these. Um, so all we had to do, um, we can fix the language in our navbar page. We talked about we know how to do that. So I'm just going to uncomment that here. Another thing we had, there was, if we was, if we run the, I'm going to run this, this version. It looks like I checked some of the contrast on the front page actually. So if I did the wave extension here on our welcome page, it actually identified an error with this contrast of this HTML link here. And you can see here, once I implemented that language, it now tells us green for the language there. We fixed that error, and it detects that. But let's see. Yeah, this is where it is. So basically it has this feature here for the wave tool, where it is looking at the contrast. Um, so, it's telling me it has a very low contrast, and you can see here you can actually change it in the tool to pick a hex value that would pass them. So these AA and triple A are different levels of contrast standards. So you can see some will pass AA and some will pass triple A. So you could use this actually to find a color value to put in here that would pass. And so I actually did that. I have it commented out here. So I have where I made this link to this Florida Department of Law Enforcement website. I can actually add a argument here called style where I can change the actual color of this. So I picked a color after kind of going through that exercise with the wave tool to find one that met the standards, and I put it in here with just the color tag. So if we were to rerun this, uh, and run our wave extension, we should pass now. Right, so it's a slightly different color, a little bit darker blue, but it passed our contrast error. So you can use that tip. You can alter some of the arguments in those tags to pick a specific color. The other thing you can do is play around with the theme for the navbar page to find one that meets the contrasts better. Okay, let me exit some of these out. Okay, so let's talk about the alt text option here. Um, Unfortunately, so we talked about Plotly plots, the interactive ones from the last session. As far as I know, there's not a way to actually add alt text into those at the moment. We can, however, add them for static plots like our ggplots that we created before. And there's two ways to actually do this fairly easily. Actually, in our render plot, you'll remember that we have, when we call render plot, we have both parentheses and a curly bracket, and we usually just put everything within them. This is actually a scenario where we can put most of our code goes inside the curly brackets, but we can put an option outside of the curly brackets with this alt and a text string. We can also put a dynamic uh, reactive in here, and I'll show an example of that in a moment. That is the alt text that will show up. The other way to do it is actually inside. So this will work for any static plot, ggplot, or if you have, base R or something like that. But the other thing you can do is actually do this in ggplot as well. So if you're making a ggplot, in that labs argument where you can put um, like the x-axis label and the y-axis label and the main title label. You can also add an alt label here that is the alternative text for the ggplot. So we can add it there alternatively as well. So here's just a quick example of how you could do that. I've just set up, this is a, you know, a practice dashboard with just our data from Iris that we've worked with before. So I've just done this in two different ways, in our two different methods for adding alt text. So in this first one, so I'm actually doing this so it's slightly reactive. So I've created a reactive variable here called alt text one, where I have an input for a selected outcome for our data set, and I'm just making the text basically a plot showing petal width by the selected outcome. So the first method, I have it working in that render plot method where we put our ggplot inside the curly brackets, our code, and then we put our alt text here. So in this example, I'm not using a text string, but I'm using this reactive. Um, this is actually a case where it wants you to use the object without the parentheses. So normally when we want to call the value of reactive, um, we would put open and close parentheses behind it. Here we actually do not for whatever reason. Um, the other way we said we could put it in the ggplot. So here I've actually just done this with a paste, same text, a plot showing the petal width by the selected outcome, and then returned it. So we can run this quickly and just see it working. This in the browser. Okay, so this is just we have an option to which variable to analyze, change our two ggplots. So if you actually I'm right clicking in on my mouse and inspecting it in my browser. So this doesn't always show up um, unless you're using a screen reader, but you can look at um, kind of the aspects of it here. And so you can see actually this alt, a plot showing a petal width by sepal length, kind of our dynamic text that we added into it. And we should get the same thing if we were looking at this bottom plot as well. So you can see the alternative text is showing up, and that should be read by our screen reader. You can see it here. Actually, this browser does have accessibility properties as well, kind of built in. So that's cool. So that alt text only available for those static plots. Ideally, right, it should describe what the plot shows, not just, you know, what the variables are in it. That's obviously more difficult to do in this dynamic situation. But you could try to figure out a good way to do it by kind of detecting some of the properties of it as well. So those are a couple tips for accessibility. Any questions there? Okay. Our last topic for the today is kind of shifting gears back to a little bit more technical piece. We're going to talk about dynamic UI elements. So up to this point in the dashboards we've created, all the UI elements inputs have been static. And what I mean by that is when we have like a drop-down list, we've had to specify pre-specify what the items in that list are. Um, or like we couldn't have, the list be dynamic depending on what another selection in the dashboard is. Um, we've also had, you could have whether or not a plot or table shows up at all, um, as a possible dynamic piece of this as well. So in some cases, we might want that feature. For example, we could have some input option appear or not appear, whether another input option um, isn't working. We have a question here. Um, so there's a question about alt text. Is this is that something that is reading all labels specific to screen readers, but is not on the actual dashboard or plot? Um, is that something that is reading? So I think the screen readers, I think it should work similarly for all HTML. Um, so it is reading like the properties of the HTML. Um, all labels specific to reading all labels specific to screen readers. Um, I might have to think about that. Maybe you could follow up after. I'm not quite sure I understand the question 100%. Um, no problem. Um, okay. We can come back to that at the end, maybe. Okay, so making the UI dynamic. So, for example, you may have a drop-down menu, and depending on which item you choose in that drop-down menu, you want a different set of options to occur in a second drop-down menu. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Or having, something happen in the UI depending on a different element of the UI. So this starts to get complicated and in terms of how the actual computations are working under the hood for R Shiny. It's important to have a little bit of context for how the order of things works here. Um, in general, for R Shiny, we have to remember that computations happen in the server. So anytime it is deciding, it is uh, changing or computing anything, that happens in the server. So when we have these dynamic UI elements that we want to make, we actually create them in the server and they get fed back to the UI. So we're going to do this with a special server function called render UI. So a lot of our outputs that we use in the server have this render piece of them. This is just another one of those. We have a pair of functions. The server function is render UI, and then we actually put them back in the UI with a UI output statement. So let's take a look at an example of what this looks like. So imagine that, actually, I want to start with the UI. So we're just going to make up a fake new dashboard render UI example. The first thing we have in the UI is an input. Um, it is a selection. It says just make a selection. You either have a first choice or a second choice. By default, it is the first choice. Then what we're going to have in the server is a second drop-down selection that is a dynamic. And so you can see here, I'm going to call this my dynamic select output. Here's that render UI function here. So what this is going to say is if that input select static option is the first choice, I want to show A, B, and C. Um, Otherwise, I want you to show X, Y, and Z as the choices here. And then I'm going to tell it to output the select input, which is normally one of the things we would use in the UI statement, but here we're using it in the server. But the choices I'm giving it is dynamic based off of this if else choice here. And I'm telling it I'm always going to choose the first one. Um, and then I'm rendering it, and we called this thing dynamic select. And then if we go back to the UI, you can see this UI output and dynamic select. I'm outputting it there. So this is a similar select input that we've made, that we've used in the UI, except we're now making it in the server so we can change how it works to give it a dynamic selection. And then I'm just kind of adding this other piece here about which thing I selected, just to tell us. So let's take a quick look at that. Okay, so very simple. Like I said, first choice, second choice. When in first choice here, my second drop down, ABC. In the if I have the second choice, I get XYZ. That's the kind of the basis of the thing we're trying to make work here. So right as a summary, right, the first thing, because it's fixed set of options, first choice, second choice, excuse me, that happens in the UI. The second one, because it's dynamic, it needs to happen in the server and it gets fed back to the UI. Okay. Any questions about that kind of toy example? Okay, let's go to a more complicated example. We'll take our iris data set. We have four numeric variables: sepal length, petal width. We also have a categorical variable called species. We want to create an app that allows the user to select one or two of those numeric variables and computes a selected summary statistic. So if we have one variable, we want to allow it to compute the mean or the median. If we select two variables, we want to allow it to do compute the correlation. So if the user selects one variable, they'll have two different options to choose from to compute a summary statistic. If they select two, they'll only have a single one. Additionally, we'll be fancy and add an on-off for grouping it by the species. Then we'll output that summary statistic to the UI via a table. Um, One thing that can happen when you have this kind of dynamic interplay between the UI and the server is that sometimes some of the logic you're using in the server, some things aren't always available when in the logic, either temporarily or when one of the options is chosen. So there's this really handy function called require or REQ that can be used when we see temporary errors because like in the middle of some of the logic when we switch back between when we're computing these UI pieces in the server, something temporarily isn't available. So this is a way of saying these inputs or these conditions are required, otherwise don't compute the rest of the server output in the reactive. So this is a kind of a little kind of a funny concept. It requires its inputs to be, this is a technical term, truthy. Basically, it means they have to kind of exist or they're true. It's kind of a generalization of true or false. There's some technical background on that, but I always found that could be a funny statement.
Just want to make sure if you already answered Caitlin question in the chat or not.
I think we're gonna try to come back to it. Just making sure the wording. Didn't quite get the what understand the question. So maybe at the end we can come back to it. Or yeah, we'll talk about it at the end if I can get a better understanding. Um, so let's take a look at what this example here looks like. So let me run this first, and then we can look at the code. So the way this is going to work, I'm actually using a special UI input here that allows me to select more than one option at a time. So if I have just one variable, it's going to allow me to say mean or median, and then it's going to compute that. And I can also do this a group by. If I select two variables, it's going to force me to only do the correlation because it doesn't make sense to do that mean or median when I have two variables here. So the way I'm making that work, if we look at the code, um, in the server, this thing is called a select size input that is specifically letting me choose more than one thing and have some little options for it. So I'm allowing it to select more than one thing, and then I'm actually using this option that the maximum number of items it can select is two. So this is a pretty handy little alternative to the select input. And then I'm using this, I'm computing that second piece in the server, this UI statistic select. Um, and so let's take a little bit of a look at what I did there. So I'm saying if basically if the number of variables I select is equal to one, give the choices mean or median. If the number of variables I select is two, say it's the correlation, and then I'm just outputting that select input with that two stat choices. The piece to collect actually calculate the correlation or the mean is here. We won't go over that too much. But the other thing I wanted to point out is this require piece. So if we go back here, you see when I have two variables and I quickly change back and forth between them, we get that quick flash of that red error. What's actually happening there is, we have all this logic about, if computing these things and if these UI pieces um, with all this logic. Basically, what's happening is temporarily one of these logic pieces is unhappy because even though I'm changing something, there's kind of some intermediate logic that it doesn't like there. So my point is we can add some of these require statements in here, which basically tell it don't compute the rest of this until this condition is met. Um, so basically, well, one thing we could see here, it gets pretty unhappy when nothing is selected for the variables. So we can tell it only compute the rest of this if we have at least one of these things. It's actually showing me an error here. And then the other part I put in is yeah, same thing down to here, requiring that it has at least a variable here. So yeah, so that can be a helpful thing to render those UI statements in the server. Um, it does get kind of complicated. As you can see, we start to see those errors go back and forth. So I would only use this when it's necessary. You can always put your UI portions in the server, but it really should only be used when it's necessary because it makes things more complicated. And then it's always helpful to understand the order which Shiny works. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but first it renders the UI elements that are static. It then goes to the server to compute the remaining UI elements, and then we'll go back to the UI um, to output those elements into the UI. So, how you might think about using this in a take-home example, if you wanted to try it out, in our actual dashboard map, we've limited ourselves to analyzing information about one variable because it gets kind of difficult. For maps, it's easiest to show binary options in terms of like the total within one category. It's hard to show multiple categories at one time. So I chose exactly one variable there, but a different way you could set it up is to, for the map, first select a variable and then select a level within that variable to show on the map. You'd have to change something in the server as well to make this work, but that is kind of my take-home activity challenge for you there. You can also practice this on that alternative NIJ recidivism challenge dataset that we talked about today. I'm leaving that portion more open-ended for you all to try as well. And that leads me into one other final thing, kind of for the series of webinars in general. I have a final assignment for you all to practice your R Shiny skills and understanding, and receive a certificate that will come from JIRN. So I've left some of the take-home activities about the recidivism challenge data set kind of for you all to work on your own and not gone over some of the answers. So I'm actually going to have this final. So if you've done some of those already, you're pretty much done with this final assignment, which is nice. So this is going to be based off of that data set, and I've put an HTML document on the GitHub. Let me find that. Well, I've downloaded a copy here. So you should see in the main part of the GitHub, there's a folder called Final Assignment, and there's an HTML document with some details there. Basically, I want you to take that recidivism challenge data and build a dashboard with a lot of the features that we've talked about so far in the class, kind of through the accessibility. I have some bonus points for if you want to try to host it on the shinyapps.io or something we're going to talk about next time, which is suppression criteria for doing that. So please take a look at that. I think we'll also send this assignment around via email. There's some evaluation criteria and asking that you submit that to me to take a look at your work, and then you'll receive a certificate. We can also talk about that more in this next couple classes, but looking for that to have it due by basically a little bit a month from now. Okay. I do want to come back to the questions that we had, but for next time, we're also going to be talking about controlling data access and working with sensitive data. So authentication, options that are available with the different hosting software that we talked about today, but also building authentication within a Shiny app, using suppression rules in our Shiny apps, and some best practices for creating dashboard data sets with sensitive data. So that's what we have coming up. And from there, I will open it back up to questions. Maybe we can start with Caitlin. Is your mic working any better, or do you want to take another try at writing out your question in the chat? Or does anybody else have a question? I can just talk a little bit, I guess, more about the alt text in general. Um, so I guess I'm not an expert on how alt text works in general, but it reads screen readers read the HTML in the background, so they can tell um, there's some like embedded information about like levels of headers and graphics, and so it uses that to both navigate around the page as well as reads that alt text for different graphics. But it has to be kind of a characteristic that is embedded into the HTML. So it is not for these R shinies, it's not there by default. Um, but we have to put it there with this alt text for those static images. And unfortunately, for like those plotlies objects, there doesn't seem to be a way to add it on currently. Um, that would be something to keep an eye on if that's a feature they add going forward or a way to make that work. I think because those are dynamic, it's obviously just a bigger challenge to describe those dynamic type of visualizations, but obviously a good thing to try to do to be compliant. So if it is something like a requirement that you're hosting a dashboard that needs to have alt text in it, you may be more constrained in terms of your options of which tools to use to make sure that you can have that alt text there. Hopefully somewhere in there I hit on what you were interested in. But any other questions on the content today? Okay, if not, I guess we'll end things there.